I never expected my neighbor to knock on my door, or to stay the night. It was just past 10 in the evening, and I had finally collapsed onto my worn-out sofa after a long day. The city outside hummed softly, the distant rumble of traffic blending with the occasional bark of a dog. My apartment was quiet, too quiet actually, and I was enjoying the rare peace, a cup of tea steaming in my hands. I wasn't expecting anyone. Then came the knock. A sharp, almost urgent sound at the door. I froze mid-sip, my heartbeat picking up. Visitors at this hour were rare, and my mind instantly went through the possibilities. A wrong apartment, a delivery gone awry, or something stranger. I opened the door and there she was. My neighbor, no, not just a neighbor. A woman who had always carried herself with an effortless confidence that made it impossible not to notice her when we crossed paths in the hallways. She was around 42, I guessed, but there was a vitality in her that belied the numbers. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, slightly mussed by the breeze, and her light jacket was half-zipped, hinting at the casual elegance she always seemed to wear without trying. She looked flustered, cheeks slightly flushed, and her small bag hung limply from her hand. "I locked myself out," she said, her voice a mixture of embarrassment and fatigue. "I know it's late, but could I stay here for the night?" I blinked, caught off guard. My first instinct was hesitation. Her request was unusual, intimate even, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet vulnerability that softened the edges of the surprise. The tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag, made her seem human, approachable, needing help. Yeah, sure," I managed, stepping aside and motioning her in. The air shifted as she entered. There was a faint, comforting scent of her perfume mingling with the cool night air drifting in. I noticed how she moved gracefully, careful not to stumble on the threshold, and how her eyes met mine for a fraction longer than I expected. That fraction lingered in my mind like a spark. We walked to the living room, her presence filling the space with a subtle warmth. She tried to laugh off the situation, brushing a hand over her face as if to hide her embarrassment, and I offered her a blanket and a seat on the sofa. The casual intimacy of the act, the close proximity, her slight brushing past me when settling in, made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I handed her a cup of tea, our fingers brushed, a fleeting electric moment that neither of us commented on. It was small, almost meaningless, but in the quiet of my apartment that night, it carried weight. Outside, the city continued its soft hum, but inside, time seemed to pause. That night, I realized one thing. Something was different. Something about her being here, in my space, created a tension that was warm, intriguing, and entirely new. And I had no idea how much this single knock at the door would change everything. The apartment felt quieter now, yet the air between us was charged with an almost imperceptible tension. She settled on the sofa, clutching the blanket I handed her as if it were a shield. I returned to the kitchen, brewing tea, pretending that the routine clink of the kettle and the soft hiss of boiling water would keep my mind from wandering. When I brought over her cup, she looked up at me with a small, embarrassed smile that made my chest tighten. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice a little lighter now. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and I couldn't help but notice the way the light reflected in her eyes, catching just the faintest glimmer of something I couldn't name. We started talking, cautiously at first, the conversation skimming the surface. A joke about the absurdity of locking keys in an apartment, small stories about neighbors, work, nothing too revealing. But gradually, the distance between us seemed to shrink, replaced by a comfortable closeness. She laughed quietly at one of my clumsy jokes, and for a moment, the world outside the apartment, traffic, distant sirens, the hum of city life, faded into background noise. I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The faint scent of her perfume, the way her hair fell naturally around her face, the subtle tilt of her head when she was thinking. Every detail drew my attention, but I kept it contained, reminding myself this was her space too, not just the emotional curiosity stirring in me. At one point, I reached to adjust the blanket on her lap, and our hands brushed briefly. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, but it sent a quiet ripple through me. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand linger near mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I felt my pulse quicken. Something unspoken passed between us. A small, intimate acknowledgement of the space we were sharing, of the quiet tension that had begun to build. We talked about small, personal details, childhood neighborhoods, favorite books, the comforting ritual of morning coffee. I listened more than I spoke, curious about the woman in front of me, wanting to understand her in the way you can only in small, intimate moments like these. And she, in turn, opened just enough to hint at the softness beneath her confident exterior. The clock ticked on, unnoticed, as we shared silence filled with warmth rather than awkwardness. Her eyes kept drifting toward me, lingering on gestures I hadn't realized were so expressive. When she laughed, it wasn't just at my words. It was the kind of laughter that made me aware of every subtle movement, every slight inflection. By the time the tea was finished, I realized something had shifted. The initial awkwardness of her presence had transformed into something more potent. An unspoken connection that neither of us had named, but that hung between us in the quiet of my living room. The warmth of the tea had faded, but the warmth between us hadn't. And in that moment, I understood that this night, unexpected, unplanned, simple as it seemed, was already starting to change everything. The night deepened, and the city outside had quieted almost entirely. Only the faint hum of a distant siren and the occasional rumble of traffic reminded me that life carried on beyond my apartment walls. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the soft glow of the floor lamp by the sofa. The blanket she had draped over herself shifted slightly as she leaned back, the comfort of it mirroring the tentative ease beginning to form between us. She sighed, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, and I turned to notice her looking at me with an honesty I hadn't expected. The confidence she carried during the day seemed to slip, revealing a woman who was both graceful and quietly fragile. "It's strange, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice low. "How we try to appear strong, and then the smallest thing, like locking yourself out, reminds you how human you are." I nodded, unsure how much to say, but my instinct was to listen, to let her fill the space with her words. She talked about the subtle loneliness of adult life, about the small disappointments and moments of self-doubt that no one sees. There was a softness in her eyes that made it impossible not to lean in slightly, my attention fully captured. Every detail mattered, the slight tremor in her hands as she wrapped the blanket closer, the quiet rhythm of her breathing, the way she paused mid-sentence, unsure if she was being too revealing. Without realizing it, she shifted closer on the sofa, her shoulder brushing mine lightly. I felt the warmth of her presence, the gentle pressure of her arm against mine. It was unassuming, almost accidental, but in that quiet intimacy, it was transformative. I didn't move away. Instead, I let the moment linger, aware of the subtle electricity building in the space between us. She laughed softly at something trivial, a nervous sound that made my chest tighten, and I reached instinctively to offer her a sip of the tea I had brought earlier. Our fingers brushed again, this time slightly longer, and she didn't pull away. She simply let her hand rest near mine, a quiet acknowledgement of the growing connection. It was in these small, seemingly inconsequential touches that the tension became tangible, a magnetic pull neither of us could fully name. We fell into a companionable silence, words no longer necessary. I noticed her eyes wandering to the window, the way the soft lamplight highlighted the curve of her cheek and the subtle lines that spoke of experience and resilience. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort in a way that words couldn't capture, but I held back, letting her vulnerability guide the pace. That night, I realized that this wasn't just a simple favor, a neighborly gesture. It was the beginning of something more. A connection forged in quiet moments, soft touches, and the courage to let someone see you fully. And in the silence that filled the room, I felt the first stirring of something deeper, something that would slowly, irrevocably, change the way I looked at her. The sunlight crept gently through the blinds, painting soft golden stripes across the living room floor. The apartment smelled faintly of last night's tea, mingled with the lingering scent of her perfume, subtle yet unmistakable. I stirred awake on the sofa, the warmth of the blanket still holding a trace of her presence. I hadn't realized how late we'd stayed up talking, or how close we had unconsciously leaned against each other in the quiet intimacy of the night. I heard the quiet hum of the coffee maker from the kitchen and followed the sound. There she was, my neighbor, moving with effortless grace even in the early hours, her hair slightly tousled from sleep. She was humming softly, an almost imperceptible tune that made the space feel alive in a way it hadn't the night before. She noticed me standing there and gave a small, apologetic smile. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the coffee she was making. "I thought we could use a proper morning." I shook my head, smiling despite myself. There was something comforting about her presence, warmth that wasn't just physical, but emotional, the kind that makes ordinary moments feel significant. We moved around the kitchen in tandem, two people sharing space naturally, almost intuitively. Our hands brushed lightly while reaching for mugs, a fleeting touch that sent an unexpected shiver up my spine. She didn't flinch, didn't step back. She simply let the contact linger, as if acknowledging the silent thread connecting us. We settled on the sofa again, steaming mugs in hand, and for a while, we simply existed in the quiet morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun stretch across the room. The golden light highlighted the soft curves of her face, the gentle lines around her eyes that spoke of experience and resilience, and I found myself captivated by every detail. There was a beauty in the everyday, in the domesticity of the moment, that made the earlier tension of the night feel tender rather than charged. She laughed softly at a small, inconsequential joke I made, and I realized I was holding my breath slightly, savoring the sound, the rise and fall of it, the way it seemed to resonate with something deep inside me. She noticed me staring for a fraction too long and tilted her head slightly, a teasing glint in her eyes that sent warmth rushing through me. For a few moments we were silent, and yet the silence spoke volumes. The subtle intimacy of shared space, the warmth of her arm occasionally brushing mine, the way our knees nearly touched under the coffee table, created a closeness that words could never convey. I became acutely aware of her presence, of the small, graceful gestures that revealed her personality. The tilt of her head, the way she sipped her coffee, the fleeting glances that seemed to linger longer than they should. By the time the first rays of sunlight fully lit the room, I realized something profound. The night had shifted something between us. What had started as a simple act of neighborly kindness had blossomed into something more intricate, tender, and undeniable. And though neither of us had spoken it aloud yet, I felt certain that this morning, quiet, golden, and ordinary, was already the beginning of a connection that would change us both. The day had begun quietly, with sunlight streaming lazily across my apartment. But inside me, a storm of thoughts had started to build. I kept replaying last night, the warmth of her presence, the way her shoulder had brushed against mine, the subtle touch of her hand against mine when she accepted the blanket. Each memory carried a charge I wasn't used to, and I found myself questioning every small gesture. Was it really just casual? Or was there something more between us? She moved around my kitchen as if she belonged, humming softly while putting sugar in her coffee, and I caught myself watching her more than I probably should have. There was something mesmerizing about her, the calm grace with which she moved, the way her hair caught the morning light, the softness in her eyes when she glanced up at me. I felt an undeniable pull toward her, yet a voice in the back of my mind whispered caution. Neighbor, age difference, boundaries. I found myself hesitating in conversation, careful not to let my tone linger too long on personal compliments, trying to balance genuine interest with civility. She noticed my brief pauses, the way I seemed to drift for a fraction of a second before responding. Her glance held a hint of curiosity and playfulness, as if she was reading the hesitation in my body language. You're thinking too much, she teased softly, leaning a little closer, her warmth brushing against mine. The brush of her arm, casual as it seemed, made my heart skip a beat. We settled back on the sofa after breakfast, and I noticed that every small gesture between us now carried weight. The way she sipped her coffee, the tilt of her head when she laughed, even the way her knees nearly touched mine under the table. All these tiny, mundane movements were amplified in my mind. My emotions were tangled, a mix of admiration, curiosity, and a desire I wasn't sure how to express. I tried to distract myself, focusing on the mundane, pouring water into a glass, adjusting a pillow, but every action felt heavy with awareness. She caught me staring once, raising an eyebrow in that slightly teasing way she had, and I quickly looked away, embarrassed. Yet the tension wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric, subtle, and strangely comforting. I realized then that my hesitation wasn't just about social boundaries, it was about fear. Fear of misreading signals, fear of crossing a line, fear of wanting something I wasn't supposed to want. But in that fear, there was also a longing, a recognition that this connection, however complicated, was real and powerful. She seemed to sense it too, because the distance between us subtly shrank, her presence gentle but intentional, lingering in ways I couldn't ignore. By the time mid-morning approached, the emotional pull between us had become undeniable. I wasn't sure how we would navigate it, or even if we should, but I knew one thing with certainty. The hesitation, the internal conflict, and the unspoken tension had only made me more aware of how much her presence mattered. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, not with guilt, but with quiet hope, what it would feel like to explore this connection, even just a little. If you want, I can expand Keynote 6 next, the subtle confession moment, where tension peaks and emotional intimacy becomes nearly tangible. Do you want me to continue with that? You said, expand Keynote 6, 500 words. ChatGPT said, absolutely. Here's an expanded Keynote 6:4. My neighbor locked herself out, then asked to stay the night, crafted for slow-burn romance, sensory intimacy, and emotional tension. Perfect for a YouTube narrative. Part 6. Subtle confession. Expanded. Almost equals 500 words. The afternoon sun was soft and warm, casting long shadows across the living room. The apartment felt quiet in a way that made every small sound seem amplified. The faint creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant city noise filtering through the partially open window. We had moved to the sofa again, each with a cup of coffee in hand, and the silence between us was no longer awkward. It was charged, heavy with unspoken words. She shifted slightly, leaning her head toward my shoulder, a subtle motion that caught me off guard. Her hair brushed my arm lightly, the warmth of her presence radiating through the fabric of my shirt. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the moment stretch, letting the quiet intimacy sink in. It was as if the world had narrowed to the space we shared, and I became acutely aware of every detail. The soft curve of her cheek, the faint lines around her eyes that made her look both experienced and tender, the rhythm of her breathing. I've always admired how you carry yourself. I found myself saying quietly, almost as if testing the waters. The words felt heavy on my tongue, loaded with meaning I wasn't fully ready to articulate. She tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. Is that so? She whispered, her voice low, teasing, yet vulnerable in a way that made my chest tighten. Her head rested just a little more firmly against my shoulder, and I could feel the slight weight of it, grounding me in the moment. It wasn't just closeness, it was trust, intimacy, and something that hovered on the edge of desire. I wanted to ask her how long she planned to stay, how long she might linger in this space where vulnerability met unspoken attraction. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence speak for me, my arm inching slightly closer to hers, brushing against her subtly, testing, feeling, acknowledging. She laughed softly at something I muttered under my breath, a sound that made my heart lift in a way I didn't expect. Her eyes met mine briefly, and in them, I saw a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even longing. The tension between us had reached a delicate peak. Not urgent, not desperate, but undeniable. Every glance, every subtle touch, every shared silence was a confession in itself, and yet no words were necessary. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the room, and I realized just how connected we had become in a few short hours. Her presence was no longer just a neighborly inconvenience. It was a force, quietly insistent, demanding attention in the softest way possible. She shifted again, and her hand brushed against mine almost deliberately this time. Neither of us moved away. "I'm glad I knocked that night," I said softly, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything I hadn't yet dared to voice. She turned to face me, her expression softening, and for the first time, there was no teasing, no hesitation, just quiet acknowledgement. In that moment, we didn't need to define what we were feeling. The unspoken connection, the subtle confession, was enough. And for the first time, it felt safe to let it linger, to let the possibility exist without rushing it, without naming it outright. The tension had reached its peak, but it wasn't anxiety or fear. It was the delicate thrill of closeness, of understanding, of something beautiful quietly taking root. The late afternoon sunlight had softened into a gentle amber glow, spilling across the apartment in warm, honey-colored streaks. The city outside had quieted again, as if giving us space for this final stretch of the day. She had moved around my apartment with a quiet ease, picking up her bag, straightening her jacket, and occasionally glancing my way with a small, knowing smile. I could feel the weight of the unspoken between us. Hours of conversation, laughter, and subtle touches that had grown into something undeniable. Yet, despite the intimacy, there was also the knowledge that this night had been fleeting, that reality would call her back to her own life soon. The tension was no longer uncertain or anxious. It had transformed into a quiet warmth, a shared acknowledgement of what had passed and what could be. She paused near the door, her hand on the doorknob, and looked at me. For a moment, everything else disappeared. I noticed how the sunlight caught her hair, how her eyes held that mixture of confidence and vulnerability that had drawn me in from the start. "Thank you for last night," she said softly, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I didn't expect, well, this, but I'm glad it happened." I felt my throat tighten, the words I wanted to say balancing on the edge of a smile. "Me too," I whispered, stepping closer, just enough to close the distance without crowding her. The space between us felt alive, charged with all the tension and tenderness of the night and morning we had shared. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, neither speaking, letting the warmth of shared experience speak instead. Then, almost instinctively, we moved closer. She leaned into me slightly, and I offered a gentle, lingering hug. Her head rested briefly against my shoulder, the motion quiet but full of meaning. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried all the emotions that words might have struggled to convey. Gratitude, attraction, comfort, and the acknowledgement of something just beginning. Pulling back slightly, our eyes met again, and we both smiled softly, a quiet understanding passing between us. "I suppose this isn't the end," I said, my voice steady but warm. "No," she agreed, her tone gentle, almost playful. "But we'll take it slow, step by step." It was a relief, a promise without pressure, a space for something new to grow. I felt a strange combination of anticipation and calm, knowing that the night's events had changed the rhythm of our lives, even if only slightly for now. The connection we had formed wasn't fleeting. It was a beginning, fragile yet undeniable. She finally opened the door, lingering just long enough for one more subtle brush of her hand against mine. The contact was brief, but it was enough to send a shiver of warmth up my arm. She stepped out into the soft glow of the afternoon, pausing to glance back with that small, radiant smile that lingered in my mind long after she had gone. I watched her leave, the apartment suddenly quieter, but my chest still carrying the echo of her presence. There was no need to rush, no need to define the future tonight. What mattered was the connection we had discovered, the unspoken, the subtle, the tender. And for the first time in a long while, I felt certain of something simple and profound. That this night, this moment, and this bond were real, and that the story between us was only just beginning. If you enjoyed this slow burn romance, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories about unexpected connections. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything overnight?